Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. It's a huge bounce back from our previous weeks, and we are really forever grateful. And before we get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at the OBT Podcast. This episode is kind of gonna be a little all over the place. We got multiple things to talk about, and I think the first thing is definitely the Lillard drama. It continues. We've been getting massive reports like every single day. Something new is coming out, whether it be from Lillard's camp or just news around the league. But I kind of wanted to start this discussion off with a tweet from Woj that I thought was very interesting. He said, "Portland's choosing the market over Miami now, but there's no assurance a better deal on Damian Lillard develops. The Blazers don't need to love the Heat's best package to ultimately accept it. That's the Blazers battle." So that's kind of like the best way to sum up what's happened so far. Basically, Miami is not the best suitor for Dame in terms of what they're offering. They don't have a
Yep.
lot to offer. Everybody considers the Hero contract horrible. I think, that's kind of the general consensus. And Portland, I don't think really wants Hero. So they've kind of made that clear. Um, and it's kind of rough because that's the position that Dame wants to be in. He wants to go to Miami. I think his agent has pretty much barred, teams from trying to talk. And that's, a leverage play. They don't want Dame's camp doesn't want, the Portland Trailblazers to be talking to other teams, obviously, because they don't have any leverage. It's not the same as Beal, where Beal had the no trade clause and he can go wherever he wants. With Lillard, Portland can ship him off for the best deal, and that could be, like San Antonio or whatever. It could be anywhere, that offers them the best deal because they have to look out for themselves at the end of the day. It's a business. Everybody expects them to do right by him. But, if the Miami thing isn't realistic, then, what can we really do here? Basically, it doesn't seem like, everybody's on the same page here. And Miami is kind of in the losers category at this point because I mean it seems like they don't really have a deal that can be offered. So what have you been hearing about this? Because it's
Yeah.
been really ugly in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, kind of like you said, it's kind of just sort of right now, just a back and forth between, Lillard's camp and Portland's camp, right? Because obviously, like, nobody really wants to, look like they're in the role of the villain, sort of, right? So,
Right.
both sides are going to try to, kind of paint the other as doing things, right? Like, you'll see stuff like the Blazers saying, well, there were deals out there, that would have appeased Lillard in terms of like us bringing in more talent that would have made him be okay to stay in Portland,
Hmm.
right? Or you hear from Lillard's camp, right? Stuff like we will only talk to Miami, right? And that's basically it. Like he doesn't want to play for Boston.
Right.
Maybe he doesn't want to play for Utah. So again, we talked about this, when the trade first happened. The difficulty for Miami is that, compared to a lot of the other teams, they don't really have the best deal because, like you mentioned, all they really have to offer is Tyler Hero, some expiring contracts, and then,
Right.
not a whole lot of draft picks that again aren't really gonna mean a whole lot because we know Miami will be a solid team for a while.
Sure.
So that's the difficulty for Miami is they're gonna have to get in at least a third team. Mark Spears suggested that there may be like five teams, like a in
Yeah.
terms of a big 5 team trade. Um, because that's the issue, right? Because with Tyler Hero, in terms of the contract, like I think there's also been reports that suggest that Hero has some value. Like you almost wonder if he's kind of dropped into the underrated category at this
Yeah.
point. Like, because he's not a bad player. Obviously,
No.
he's got some deficiencies in terms of not a great defender. Hasn't really been a guy that's done a whole lot in the playoffs. But he is still young, right? He is a guy that's a really good offensive player. Um, but again, the issue with Portland is they don't need to bring back Tyler Hero at all because they already have their backcourt,
Right.
at least for now, set, right? You have Scoot Henderson and Anthony Simons. You don't really need to throw
And
Tyler
Shaden.
Hero in there as well, right?
Yeah.
Like that's just too many guards, right? They brought back Jeremy Grant, on a big contract,
They
so
have
that could be
Shaden
a guy,
Sharp too.
yeah, exactly. Shaden Sharp. So Jeremy Grant, maybe that's a contract you can move later on in the season. Shams thinks that this could potentially take weeks, which, again, doesn't really shock me, right? Because,
Right.
last offseason we went through, Kevin Durant basically going through, half the season all the way up until the trade deadline, right?
Right.
Where, will he or won't he get traded? So it wouldn't shock me if it went pretty far. I mean, I feel like, for Miami, because there's still like, some roster stuff that they have to take care of in terms of signing players. I feel like they're under more pressure to get it done now,
Yes.
right? Because the free agent market is at this point is pretty rough. There's very few
Yeah.
big impact players left for the most part.
Especially now.
Yeah, exactly, especially now. And I think some of those guys are kind of just on hold, probably waiting to see what happens with this trade stuff, right? Because we didn't even mention, right, Harden, right? No trade has happened for that one either.
Right.
Um, Right, and we know Daryl Morey, right? He could potentially hold out, and wait a while before he moves Harden, or maybe he doesn't move him at all. I don't know, because we're at this weird point where I think even with Durant last year, right? Initially, when he first requested the trade, and it was like he wants to go to Phoenix, right? So then we all
Okay.
thought, okay, he's probably going to Phoenix, right? Then we had the long stretch where it was like, they're only looking for the best deal, and then it was always stuff like, Team X is interested in trading for Durant, but they're not going to give up, any real significant assets, right?
Right.
Like they mentioned like Memphis, right? Like a lot of people mentioned Memphis as a scenario for Durant, and then it was like, well, they want Durant, but they don't want to give up John Morant or Desmond Bain or Jaren Jackson Jr. And it's like,
So
well,
it's
those
like
are your
who?
three
Yeah.
best players. So at that point, if you're not giving up any one of those three guys, right, then you're not really that serious
Right.
about it. Um, and then, at the end of the day, where did he go? He ended up going to Phoenix. Now
And
we've seen
Phoenix
some
had
other
that
stuff.
leeway because they
Right.
had the young players like McCall Bridges.
Yeah.
You know.
And they ended up, yeah, and it ended up actually being a better deal for Brooklyn than
Right.
you would have expected. Um, but it is kind of interesting because we have seen some stars, right, get traded to where they want to go to, right? We obviously Beal, obviously Durant, right? Even Harden got traded to both teams that he
Right.
wanted to go to because he wanted to go to either Philly or Brooklyn, and he ended up going to both.
Yeah.
AD, right? He got to LA.
Yeah.
Paul George got to LA to join Kawhi, right? Westbrook, he asked out of Washington to go to LA. So
Right.
we've seen a lot of that. Um, and we have seen some guys not go necessarily to places that were at the top of their list, right? Kawhi went to Toronto. I'm sure that wasn't at all anywhere at the top of his list.
Kyrie.
Kyrie, yeah,
Yeah.
he went to Boston. So I mean, we've seen it before. Um, but I think for Miami, it all comes down to can they manage to rope some other teams in there? Because if they
Yeah.
can, then I think there's a potential for a deal to get done. But again, the issue is once you start adding in a third team, the trades become much more difficult to pull off. Because again, we've talked about it. Maybe some type of package, right? Where let's say Lillard goes to Miami, maybe Hero goes to a third team like a Brooklyn, right? Obviously, my Portland gets back, maybe like some contracts over
Mhm.
from Miami, like Duncan
And
Robinson and picks. Maybe they get some picks from Brooklyn, but again, that's just three teams. So, that's kind of the difficulty with the Lillard stuff. And, like I said, for some of the guys that are waiting to sign with teams, it's tough for them too.
yeah,
Because they're waiting and they're on kind of hold in
it's
terms of
all
like trying to
contingent
figure
on
out.
that.
Yeah, exactly. With the agents in terms of trying to figure out where they should go, right? Christian Wood, right? He's still out in the free agency market, right? His market's pretty much completely tanked
Mhm.
at this point, right? Because he was on a relatively decent contract before. Then Dallas doesn't bring him back. So now he's probably forced to take either like some exception level money or even the veterans minimum.
Yeah.
So, and that's the interesting thing with Miami is if you can get Lillard, obviously you still kind of need to fill out the roster with some more players because they're going to have to send more players out than just Tyler Hero in order to get Lillard because their contracts don't align.
Right.
So, I think for Miami, there's definitely a lot of pressure to get it done because obviously we've heard rumors about other teams interested, right? Like they've mentioned Boston, they mentioned Philly, they mentioned the Clippers, even Utah was a team that was thrown in there. I just don't know. I mean, I still feel like Miami like is the destination where I feel like ultimately he's gonna end up, but at the same time, there's no guarantee,
Yeah.
because Portland doesn't have to send him to Miami if there's not a good deal. But then at the same time, right, his agent can kind of scare off these other teams, and you might see these teams decide, well, we may not want to trade for a guy that doesn't want to be here
Yeah.
because
Because the
then he might
narrative is he's unhappy. That's the
right
quote.
exactly yeah because
They're
apparently he's
getting an
all
unhappy player.
right. Like you said, and he's already not too happy because he's
Right.
been in Portland and they've been losing. So, to go from one unhappy situation to another, that's the tough part, right? Because, like, let's say if he gets traded to Brooklyn, I don't think Brooklyn is going to have a much better chance to win a title if they add Damian Lillard. Because, I
No.
mean, I don't think the roster is good enough to where are they a Damian Lillard away from, championship contention?
No.
Probably not.
No.
Miami, I think you could say that because if they got him and they didn't have to give up either Bam or Butler, which they're not going to,
Right.
then they're to me right there with Milwaukee or Boston, in terms of like who could come out of the East.
Yep.
Um, Philly, if they got Lillard, obviously they would be, I think significantly better because I'd say Lillard at this point is still, a better player than Harden.
Hmm.
Uh, but at the same time, I guess we'll just have to kind of just wait and see, how this goes because, like I said, Shams mentioned it could take weeks, and it just kind of depends. Vegas will be interesting because oftentimes it's been talked about that sometimes like these type of deals are talked about, and discussed in Vegas, right? Because the GMs are there, and the coaching staffs are there, and the summer league is kind of the last bit in the off season before like some people are kind of just like on vacation for a little
Right.
bit. So there's a chance, but again, we sat through this last year where we had multiple guys with trade requests, and then nothing literally happened until the regular season, other than the Donovan Mitchell trade.
Right.
And he didn't. Yeah, he'd be another guy, right? That didn't go where he thought he was going to go. He thought he was headed to New York.
Yeah.
So, but Cleveland ended up, having a pretty good deal.
And
That
he
they sent
seems
back.
happy there too.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. They sent back multiple picks. They sent back Laurie Markkinen, who ended up being better than expected.
hmm.
They sent back, I think, Ochai Agbaji, right, who was a lottery pick, I think. If I'm or not lottery pick, I guess. Well, yeah, I guess he was a lottery pick,
Yeah, I
wasn't
think you're right.
it? Yeah, exactly, a lottery pick, and they sent back Sexton. So that ended up being a pretty good deal.
Right.
Um, so it could happen, right? There's a possibility that another team, but then it's like like say even the Spurs, right? Ramona Shelburne mentioned that was a possible
Yeah.
scenario, but are they really going to put together a deal to get Damian Lillard? And if they do
No.
that, are they a team that's going to be in the mix for title contention? I just
No.
don't see it.
They
I
need
mean,
to just build around Wemby. Simple
yeah,
as that.
yeah, I don't think they're ready yet to like, acquire a superstar guy,
No.
at this point. I mean, obviously if you can do it and not give up a ton, might as well.
You need to
Um,
wait till Wemby comes into his own.
yeah, that's the thing cuz there was, a lot of talks in free agency about people potentially flocking to the Spurs, and that just didn't happen. Instead,
Right.
they ended up being like some of these other teams with cap space where they've kind of just been a team that's just been taking on contracts and trades, right? Like they
Right.
just, we'll get into it once we get into, the news rumor stuff at the end, right? But they took back another contract in Reggie Bullock from
Hmm.
Dallas. So, um it makes sense that this will take a while, right? Cuz I never thought that these trades aren't usually like quick trades.
No.
They usually take
They
some time.
drag on.
Yeah, they drag on because obviously teams are trying to figure out, what the best they can do is. But hopefully, there's a resolution to it because it's kind of at this point just the back and forth kind of gets old at this point. It's like obviously, you don't want to just rush in and make a terrible trade if you're Portland, but it's like, at this point, find a good trade or just kind of just, let it go. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I guess at this point, now that he's requested a trade, you almost kind of have to do it.
Yeah.
Uh,
This has been years in the making.
Yeah,
So,
so we'll see where it goes. Like I said, I
um,
still feel like he goes there, but if he
yeah,
doesn't, obviously it would be because, another team stepped up to the plate and offered
a
a
really
better deal.
sweet deal. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Which again, if it's there, you do take that if you're Portland. If there's a better deal out there than what you would have expected, then I mean, there's no way you can say no to that.
Yeah. And for me, like, I don't know. For some reason, I feel like Harden is going to be in the mix with this trade. And
Maybe.
also Ben Simmons. I don't know why I feel like Brooklyn is probably
Yeah,
going to move on
that's
from Ben Simmons, and I think he's might be a part of this trade. So we'll
yeah,
see. It
that's
could
the
be a
other contract.
huge, yeah, it could be like a huge, like, 5-team trade. It'll be difficult to pull off
Right.
because, there's always things that happen, guys' injury history, or somebody just pulls out of the deal and it doesn't work and falls apart because of one team or one person. So I'm
Yeah,
very
because
curious, but I think those two guys are definitely going to be involved.
right, because when you think about it, that's really the only at this point, like the only like bad ish contract that Brooklyn has, right? Because
Right.
they have Cal Bridges who's on a great contract.
Hmm.
They just signed Cam Johnson to a
Yep.
new deal, right? But they traded Joe Harris away, so he's not there anymore.
Right.
Some of those other older guys, right? Like Dorian Finney-Smith and Royce O'Neal, they're on like expirings. And then other guys like Seth Curry and Patty Mills, they're gone, right?
Right.
So Ben Simmons, yeah, like he's making 37 million this year, 40 million next year. So that's
Max contract
definitely
player, dude.
yeah, exactly. And Brooklyn is a team where they're looking probably to, you know, even if they don't contend for a title, they have no incentive to be bad, because they don't have their own pick,
Right.
for the most part. So like they're kind of in a position to where they need to at least, be a solid team next year. And again, like if they can move Ben Simmons and bring in somebody else, like, if they brought in like a Tyler Hero or somebody like that, that's not really, a bad scenario if you're
Right.
Brooklyn. right? Obviously, it would be better if you got Lillard, but I just don't think that that Brooklyn team, by adding Lillard, is gonna be a championship caliber team. You
I
know what I
get you.
mean?
I know what you
Yeah.
mean.
Like, I
It's
don't
not
look
going to
at
put
it
them
as
over the hump.
yeah, exactly. Like, I don't look at a deal simply as, do you win the championship or not? Like, my question is, does it get you close enough to where if things break your way, you can be in that mix? And
Right.
I don't feel like it would be enough for Brooklyn to be in the mix.
Yeah, they've still got a little bit of work to do, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, exactly.
I guess, we should probably move into our next segment, which is more Summer League oriented. Just as a reminder, we're heading out to the Summer League. If you're watching this Friday, it'll be, today. But we're recording this on Thursday, obviously. But, the Summer League has started in a way. We have the California Classic. If you don't know what that is, it's kind of like a mini tournament before the Vegas Summer League. It was hosted by the Kings this year. So it was pretty cool. We got a little sneak peek at some guys, not a lot of them, but I think the biggest story from this, is definitely Brandon Miller. Um, he struggled, but overall, what were your thoughts on the California Classic? I thought it was pretty entertaining. It seems like they're building, something special there. Um, and giving a lot of these teams and players a really interesting chance to shine, prior to the Vegas Summer League, which is kind of the big stage of this off season.
Yeah, the California Classic is always, kind of intriguing because obviously, the highlight of the summer league is always Vegas, right? But because there's always multiple summer leagues, right? You have the one in Orlando,
Hmm.
which is like closed off for pretty much everybody, right? So nobody really goes to that. You have the one I believe in Salt Lake City. That's the one that Chet was playing in.
Yeah.
And then of course you have the California Classic and Vegas, right? Those are kind of the two bigger ones that everybody gets to see.
Right.
But like you said, it's always, cool to watch the summer league because again, it's very different, for the most part compared to the regular NBA games, right? Pretty much young guys. The way that they play, the way that they're running things isn't, like how you would normally see, right? It's a little bit more chaotic, but that's
Hmm.
just because of the style. Um, with me, whenever I look at the summer league, I'm not gonna lie, I don't usually like regard it in the sense of like if somebody struggles in the summer league, it doesn't really like move me in terms of like how good or bad they're gonna
Right.
be. Mainly just because like it's such a small sample size of games.
Yep.
Um and like, we've seen a number of like, high level players struggle in the summer league. Like Trey Young famously, was awful in the Vegas summer
Yes.
league, right? People, were kind of coming out of the woodwork saying that he was a bust already, right? And
Yep.
now he's, obviously a really good player. Um so that's how I kind of look at it there. Sometimes you can kind of gather some things like, maybe you might want to look at how are they struggling, right? Is it more so that they're just missing shots, right? Because that's not exactly the same in terms of struggling because anybody can have a stretch where they miss shots.
Right.
So is it that they're missing shots? Is it that they're making poor decisions, right?
Right.
Do they look kind of physically overmatched, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes that can be kind of a concern.
Or if a
Uh,
guy looks lost,
yeah,
completely,
or
like
if
it
a
doesn't
guy
belong.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and like sometimes you'll see that, right? Because when you look at the rosters, many of the guys on the roster are more so just like guys that are kind of there, right? They're not guys that are going to be on the NBA roster,
Right.
come
It's their
next season.
job interview sometimes
Yeah,
too. A
exactly.
lot of them are playing and competing
Right.
for a contract, two-way
Yeah.
contract. So there is some form of
Yeah.
competitiveness.
There's there's an
Yeah.
incentive for everybody, even
Right.
for the guys that aren't drafted,
Right.
because, like you said, there's always an opportunity that might open up, like you said, either for a two-way, maybe a spot on a G League team, or sometimes you might have a guy that plays well and then maybe they can get some type of contract overseas. So there's a lot of incentive, for these guys to play, because I think some people do kind of just look at it more so from the NBA draft perspective, but sometimes we've seen other guys, right, that, kind of made their way in the summer league, right, and kind of made a name for themselves, right? Like we've seen guys like say Austin Reeves was undrafted.
Yeah.
He's good in the summer league. He was initially a two-way guy, right? Then gets moved up to the regular roster, and now he's um, getting paid on a new contract right before, everybody in his draft class, right? So he's the first guy of that draft class to get like, a bigger deal.
Right.
Um, since he was only a 2-year um guy initially,
Yeah.
right? And then, even when you look at, some of these other guys, I mean, like, obviously there are guys that did play very well, in the, summer leagues historically, right? Like, we've seen, some of the superstars play really well, even some of the other guys, right? Like, I think De'Aaron Fox, was really good in summer league. Or I remember, that famous Lakers summer league team, right? That had like Lonzo,
Yeah.
Ingram, Kuzma. Um,
Yeah,
so
Kuzma really showed
yeah,
his colors
exactly. That's
there.
kind of where he blew up because
Mhm.
nobody really knew as much about him. Even guys like Josh Hart. And again, I'm not trying to just make it about the Lakers, but I just
No, I know
remember,
what you mean though.
yeah, I just remember that there are always really good standouts in summer league. And some guys do play, do go crazy in the summer league, and then they get to the regular NBA and then it don't look as great.
Right.
So it just kind of depends. And that's kind of the tough part, right? Say like a Kevin Knox. I think if I remember correctly, he had a decent summer league showing.
Yeah,
You know,
everybody's kind of hyped about him.
yeah, exactly. Other than the Zion thing that happened with him, right? He had a pretty solid summer league showing,
Yeah.
but then he didn't really hasn't really panned out in the NBA so far.
Right.
So that's kind of the tough thing I think about the California Classic is because everybody's really quick to react. Like Brandon Miller, he had a couple of really rough
Yeah, they were
summer
really
league
bad.
games. Yeah, I think including like 6 points, 8 fouls.
Yeah,
Um,
like in total, I think he's racked up 15 fouls in 2 games. So
yeah,
obviously, in the NBA that's illegal, but in the summer league
right.
it's different rules. But he only has 24 points, 9 rebounds, 10 assists, and 10 turnovers. So it's not looking great. But I don't think that's a reason to overreact and jump the gun. I've seen a lot of people saying, passing on Scoot Henderson for Brandon Miller will be an all-time mistake, things like that. Which I mean, in perspective, you could say that, but at the same time it's only been 2 games, and we don't need to overreact right now, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because again, like there's right. We saw Keegan Murray, right? He played in the summer league.
Yeah,
He's at a point where he's probably a little too good to be in the summer league.
yeah,
But I don't really have a problem, with it because again, like you're playing, you're just getting you're
practice.
getting, yeah, you're getting your practice in, getting your wind in, right, staying in shape. So
And his
I
coach
don't really have,
wanted him to do that. So, and he
yeah,
didn't challenge it with an ego. He just did what he was told to do. So,
yeah,
I love it.
exactly. And and there's people that have played well, in this summer league, right? We've seen guys like you mentioned, right? Obviously, some of the other draft picks, like I guess not in the California Classic quite as much, but right, say like Chet Holmgren, right? He's
Right.
kind of in his sort of for real now rookie year,
Yeah, his
right? And
redemption arc.
yeah, his redemption arc, he's been pretty solid, right? We've seen some other guys, right? That aren't necessarily like rookies, but young guys, right? Like
Mhm.
Lester Quinones, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Jordan
exactly.
Poole 2.0.
Yeah, exactly. He's been pretty solid in the summer league. Now, again, is he going to do that when they get to the NBA?
Right.
Maybe. It's
And I think he
possible.
was on a deal last year, but he just didn't really
Yeah,
play, right? And I
he
think that
was
was
like a two-way guy.
yeah. So,
Yeah,
but he's
yeah,
playing for a roster spot. So,
exactly.
that's what a lot of this is
Right,
for a lot of
exactly. And like,
people.
yeah, exactly. Like we've seen guys, say like Colin Castleton, the big for LA, right? He's been, fine, I guess. Just in terms of like being a versatile big, right? Hood Scafino, like you mentioned, right? Can't shoot so far.
Right.
Gotten better at the rim, right? But obviously the shot isn't there right now. But again, like, just when you look at the summer league, I don't know. It's just again, you kind of just have to wait and see, right? Like Derek Jones Jr. had a crazy summer league, and he's a solid player,
Right.
right? But when you saw him in the summer league, you'd almost be thinking like this guy's going to be, a big time star. And again, he's a good player, but that's just kind of how it is, right?
And this is like this is more for the execs and the coaching staff to
Yeah,
analyze and evaluate, some of their unsigned
yeah,
guys, see who's going to make the roster. It's basically tryouts and also, obviously showcases for, the bigger name guys like people like Wemby who will be playing on Friday. So it's like, it's more of a gauge. It's not necessarily for, in my opinion, I never really thought the summer league was like for the public to make, judgments. I always thought it was more for like the teams to like, say, okay, we know how this guy operates,
right.
strengths, weaknesses, whatever schemes.
Yeah.
So it's
The
just cool. I love it.
very least, what you want to see, I would suppose, is growth.
Yes.
Because again, like if somebody's making mistakes, right? Do those mistakes get cleaned up, in the next game,
Yeah.
right? Do you see maybe like if there's sort of a confidence issue, right? Or maybe there's things that they're not doing. Are they doing that better in the next game from game? That's kind of what you want to see. And again, like game to game growth is, a little bit difficult just because, the speed. And I think also that's the other thing you have to factor in, right? Because now that you're playing closer to NBA level competition, um, it's a huge adjustment, when you have to adjust to the speed of the game because it's very different from the college level, which is played at, a little bit slower of a pace.
Yes.
Everything's a lot more set, right? They're running a lot more, like basic sets and everything
Right.
like that, running plays, everything's kind of going through the coach. Whereas, at the NBA level, a lot of times, the players are kind of like reading the floor on the
Yep.
fly.
And the
And they
coaches
have
just make adjustments.
yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's kind of the other aspect of it. And but again, we've seen guys struggle before. Like you mentioned, Brandon Miller didn't have a great showing.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see him in Vegas, I suppose. And we'll get into that in a minute.
Yeah.
If he looks better there, and if that talk kind of quiets down. But with social media, this kind of is a thing now that happens. Where now that we can see these games, and we can see them on TV, see them public.
And
Um,
talk about them on the
you know,
internet.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. People will talk about them, and if guys are struggling or playing really well,
They're gonna
we'll
get
latch
ripped to
on.
shreds.
Yeah, exactly. And if guys, play really well, then they'll get talked about a ton, right? As the second coming of somebody else.
Exactly. Like on
So
Twitter right now, like people are just giving, Brandon Miller a really hard time. Like they're pointing out stats that, we point out when we play 2K, having more fouls than, field
yeah,
goals, stuff like that. It's like,
right.
okay, come on. It's 2 games. Just let them get comfortable. A lot of these guys have nerves, a lot of pressure. Some of them have the franchises on their backs. But I don't know. It's just rough to see, people attacking, some of these players
And
off of
again,
a couple bad
yeah,
performances.
and again, like, is it possible that he might not be as good as you might hope that he would be? It's certainly possible, but I wouldn't be at this point. At this point, I'm not going to base it off of 2 summer league games. I just think
Right.
that's
It's an
like a little too
overreaction.
early. Yeah, I think it's an overreaction to what's a very small sample size against, like, as well as like unique circumstances, right? Because
Right.
again, even though they're on a team, right, it's not quite as organized, right? These guys haven't spent a ton of time playing together, right? So it's like there's a lot of variables and a lot of other factors. So I'm just not ready, to go there yet. I think, sometimes we kind of have to hold on, and wait before we like really really have real reactions, because again,
Right.
even in the playoffs, I talked about, after game ones of series, can't always overreact to game ones. Sometimes they mean something, and then other times they don't. So
Right.
it's possible some of these guys' poor performances or great performances mean something, for sure,
Yeah.
but it's also possible that they don't mean anything. So at this point, we just kind of have to see what they do once we get to the NBA season, which is still a few months away.
Yes.
Yeah. So now I guess we're gonna get into our guys that we're kind of interested, in seeing one, because as we talked about, right, we're gonna be out in Las Vegas to see the first half of the summer league
Hmm.
between the 7th to the 11th. So you'll see, an episode or two where we'll be talking about, what we saw at the summer league.
Right.
Um yeah, so I guess like I said, we'll get into our three guys that we're interested in seeing for the summer league. So I'll let you
Sure.
start us off.
Yeah. Obviously, number one, this goes without really saying, but it's Wemby. Um, Everybody's gonna be there. It's a sold out arena. It's at capacity. So we were fortunate enough to even be able to attend. But in terms of him, there's a lot of pressure. If he has a stinker debut, it's kind of gonna be the same thing with Brandon Miller. People are gonna say he's automatic bust. If he gets hurt, then automatic, made of glass cannon. So it's like, okay, like the narratives are going to be written regardless, because at the same time, if he has a great game and drops like 30 points, a 30-point triple double or something like that, or maybe like a 30-point double double, people are going to start
Yeah.
glazing him and calling him like, the best player in the NBA. And it's like, okay, that's also a bit of an overreaction. So, whether it be hot or cold, it's going to shake up, the narrative on his career from the jump. But there's a lot of hype surrounding him. Obviously, he's one of a kind, undisputed number one, best player in the draft class. But, and it also will go to show how the Spurs are going to use him. Like, are they going to, kind of just let him do whatever he wants to do? Or are they going to, wait to call his number? Because that's another thing. Like, people don't realize a lot of these guys, they aren't getting their numbers called a whole lot. With Brandon Miller, it seemed like, they weren't calling his number. He looked a little timid just due to the fact that it was probably nerves. So I'm curious to see, how nerves are going to affect him. And my prediction for him, what I think is going to happen, I think he's probably going to get cooked off rip, but then later on in the game, you're going to see him start to like adjust on the fly and start pinning stuff off the backboard and things like that. Cause you got to realize they're playing against Charlotte on his debut. So, the big man spot at Charlotte is kind of interesting, but I don't think it's any competition for him, honestly. So I think it's gonna be a cakewalk for him, but I think the first few possessions where he's on defense, he might get beat a little bit. Um, just due to the fact that it's a game speed, not a lot of practices are played at full game speed, so I'm curious to see how he adjusts to that. But overall, I think it's going to be really cool to watch. Whether it's a hot or cold performance, I think it's going to be funny to see, say he has a cold performance and then, a year fast forward to, coming to the end of the season, he wins rookie of the year because he's averaging astronomical numbers. Well, then that means the summer league game didn't mean jack diddly squat. So I'm very curious to see how um, the narrative shapes out to be with his career just off of these, summer league games that we're going to get, because we don't know how many he's going to play, but he's confirmed and expected to play on Friday.
Yep.
And then my next one is kind of a combo between two guys. This is the Miller Scoot debate. I think this will also be ignited on Twitter as well. Once both of these guys play in Vegas, we're probably going to see, people start really getting deep into the debate between, did Charlotte make a mistake on drafting Brandon Miller over Scoot Henderson, things like that, because, we've already went over it. Brandon Miller had a really rough start. Didn't shoot well from the field, and most of his points in his debut game came from the line, which is something that's kind of interesting because if you watched Alabama basketball, you kind of know that that's his game. Like, he can be very streaky at times, but when he's hot, he's hot. But when he's off, he's very off, but he's able to get to the line, which is a good characteristic that you want to have in a potential star player. And it's like, it's kind of interesting. Like, I remember um there was a quote. I can't remember who it was by. Sorry. So, but I think it was actually Roy Williams. I think that's his name, the coach for UNC.
UNC.
Yeah, he was
Yeah.
like, with Michael Jordan, he had a switch, that he could turn on and off, where it was like, his game was just always on that level, but he never turned that switch off. But with Brandon Miller, he has that switch too, but he can't control it. It's kind of like it's on and off. So that's where the streakiness comes into play. But then, if you look at somebody like Scoot, who we haven't seen play, in the summer league, I don't think, right?
Yeah. No, he
Yeah.
hasn't played.
So he hasn't made his debut yet. So a lot's riding on his debut as well, because he can prove that, he should have been number two. And we could be potentially seeing, a huge debate spark there. But he's got a lot to prove as well, because, now with the Lillard thing, he's going to be, the Lillard replacement basically. And he's probably going to have the keys to the franchise, which is cool to see. But, will he be able to step up to the plate? I think so. I think the work ethic is there. I think the grind is there. And he's definitely got the physical and basketball attributes to definitely take over in the summer league. So I'm curious to see, how he plays as well. So that's kind of like, where I sit with that debate. And then my third one is Bilal Coulibaly. This is the Wizards pick. I'm just throwing this in because I'm the Wizards fan, but I'm curious to see how he plays because, in all honesty, we haven't seen him play a lot of high level basketball. So that's my biggest concern. So I think this will be a huge um, moment for him, to prove that he can actually play at this level competitively, and be the guy that the Wizards hope he can be, because I feel like his ceiling is pretty high, but his floor is really low. Like, I feel like his floor is just one of those, another international guy that turns out to be a bust, but his ceiling, could be himself or somebody like Kawhi, something like that. So I'm really curious because he has a lot of playmaking potential, a lot of defense, athletic ability as well. The shot, not so much, but that can be developed. We've seen guys jump in percentages astronomically over, like, 3-4 years. So I'm not too worried about that. But I'm very curious to see how he plays. And I think the Wizards are slotted to play against the Spurs as well. So I'm curious to see how he plays against Wemby. Um, but yeah, this is a big deal because this is a pick that the Wizards traded up for. So I'm curious to see the ramifications on that, what people are going to be saying about him. And I don't really have any honorable mentions, honestly, but, I feel like the honorable mentions is pretty much everybody because this is their showcase. This is their time to shine. There are a couple guys that can't play because they're hurt. Shout out Trace Jackson, but I don't know. It's going to be interesting because there's a lot of good guys here, but there's also some guys that we have some questions about, and I'm sure that, they're on your list. So I'll let you kind of talk.
Yeah, so for mine, I guess for my honorable mention, it's not really a player, but I'm kind of interested to see the flopping.
Oh yeah, the text. Yeah,
Yeah, the change to the rules and flopping. I
right.
believe there was one that was awarded, in the California
Yeah.
Classic so far.
What was it, Trey
Obviously,
Man?
if you hadn't heard, I think so.
Yeah.
So obviously, if you hadn't heard about it, right, they changed or they're testing out a new change in the flopping rule. So now, if you get caught flopping, they're gonna give you, I guess like a non-unsportsmanlike tech or whatever, right?
Yes.
So kind of like I guess like the 3 seconds
Right.
defensively rule or
Yes. It's like a
hang or something
violation.
like that. Yeah, exactly. So that'll be kind of interesting to see, right? Because obviously flopping is something that a lot of people have, not really been excited to see in, the last, stretch of basketball over the last several years. And they tried initially to make some attempts to change some stuff up, right? Like finding players, and it just never really went anywhere. So I kind of threw that in sort of as a humorous one.
Right.
But in terms of the actual players, right? My first one I have, this is kind of a cheating one, I suppose, but it's
Okay.
Chet Holmgren. Reportedly, he's going to be playing in the Vegas Summer League, if I'm not mistaken.
Big deal.
Um, Obviously, he was a guy that played in the Summer League last year, right? So this isn't his first rodeo, but he missed his, actual rookie season, right? Because obviously he had the foot injury, playing in the Pro Am leagues, over the summer last year. So I'm kind of interested to see how he looks this time around, right? With a season that where he didn't really play at all, but
Hmm.
kind of just focused on rehab and improving his body, right? They've said he's put on 13 pounds of muscle.
That's good.
Since he was drafted, I believe he was about 195 when he was drafted. Now he's up to 208, if I'm not mistaken. So, obviously still pretty small, pretty slight.
Yeah.
But adding, extra muscle is a big deal.
Yes.
We hear this. I feel like we do hear this every year, though, in terms of like, player X has added, a bunch of muscle or has,
Lonzo.
lost X amount of weight. Yeah, exactly. We've heard that before. And it's, again, he's looked pretty solid in the Utah Salt Lake City League. But I am kind of interested to see, what he looks like, right? Considering he was, he's supposed to be, a big part of Oklahoma City's young core, right? That youth movement that they got going on in there where they've had
Hmm.
a ton of success with their young guys, right? Shea Gilgeous-Alexander, who they didn't draft, but they traded for, but Josh Giddey, Jalen Williams, right? And in addition to that, other young guys that are coming in, right? Cason Wallace, who they just drafted. So I'm just curious to see how he looks, right? Considering, they've been kind of missing, somebody from that big man spot. So, and he's a guy that was kind of projected to be really good defensively despite his slight frame.
Right.
So
People
if he
forgot
can
about that.
actually, exactly. So if he can, kind of be that legit two-way big for Oklahoma City, right? I think that's going to be, a really impressive factor to add to the, to their team, right? Because they seem like they love having, these bigger, skilled guys, right? That can do more, than just, one thing, right?
Right.
That where they're versatile with the ball in their hands. Because Chet can kind of do that as well. So
Hmm.
that's kind of what I'm looking for him. The next one, I said Asura Thompson, but I'm kind of cheating where I might as well just put both the
Yeah.
Thompson twins in there.
They're basically
Um,
one and the same in terms of who they are.
Yeah, I mean they are twins. But the one reason why I have them in there is because I feel like they're kind of an interesting mix of picks, right? Considering they are the first players from that overtime elite league, and that's kind of a league that I feel like some people have sort of looked at as not really that serious of a league in
Right.
regards to the level of competition in there.
Right.
Obviously, it's the league with people I believe between the ages of 16 and 20. So obviously it's a different level of competition compared to say college basketball or the guys that went to the G League Ignite or the people that played overseas. So I think that's going to be interesting to see how they look, because this is a different level of basketball. We know their strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, they're, A tier athletes, as far as I'm concerned. Um, right? They have a pretty good feel for the game in terms of, playmaking, and defense. But at the same time, right, what does the shooting look like, right? Because we know that their jump shots, have been, not really the greatest in terms of, either the mechanics or the efficiency.
Sure.
So, if, obviously, I'm sure most of these guys know what they need to work on. So that's kind of going to be something I'm interested in seeing, in terms of how do they respond to the change in speed and the change in pace of the NBA, right?
Right.
Considering how, again, overtime elite. It's a different league compared to what we've seen other guys come out of. And then the last one, Jet Howard, right? And you could almost, if you want to, extend it, with the two Orlando picks, because I feel like people's reactions to Orlando's draft have been somewhat mixed.
Hmm.
I feel like some people, for the most part, like the Anthony Black pick. I know that
Yeah.
there are people that are a little bit more mixed on it than others, but I feel like most people are relatively down on the Jet Howard pick, mainly just because I think he was projected to go lower in the first round as opposed to, like a top, 10, 11 pick.
Yeah.
Um, Obviously, we know he's or excuse me, Jawan Howard's son.
Hmm.
Went to Michigan, right? Same school as his father. So, I'm just kind of interested to see, what he looks like, just from an overall perspective, right? He's looked at as more of sort of like a scorer, um, right? Has some limitations, in terms of the wingspan, and then, some people don't like his defense.
Hmm.
So that's kind of just something I'm interested to see, because Orlando, right? They had two lottery picks, and they used both of them on two guys that I don't think people really project as stars.
Yeah.
And in fairness, we talked about this a lot in the draft, right? Where there were three guys sort of at the top that project to be really, really, really good, and then everyone else is kind of more so like not like a utility guy, right? But just that lower tier of players, right?
Right.
Where they're not superstars, right? But there are guys that either have maybe some level of star potential or more so like high level role player potential.
A lot of them
Um,
have high floors and low ceilings. That's the best way to
yeah,
put it, I think.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of what I'm looking at there, right? Because Orlando, they've done a pretty solid job in the draft the last few years, right? Taking Paolo number one when he wasn't expected to go number one. Franz Wagner, they traded for Wendell Carter Jr. They didn't draft him, right? But they traded for him. So I mean, I feel like they've done a relatively solid job in the draft. So I feel like, with them, I feel like they see something in both of those guys. So I'm interested to see what they look like. But like I said, more so Jet Howard because I feel like he was the one that was the more controversial, surprising pick.
Yeah.
So those are my three choices I have for what I'm interested in seeing for Vegas.
Yeah, I agree. I think those are all good choices, Um, Jet Howard has a lot of question marks. I've said it multiple times. I know he can do, he can shoot, and that's about it, honestly. Um, but yeah, I think that those are all valid.
Yeah, exactly. Um, so now I guess we'll get into some of the more news and rumors covering the league. Obviously, basically right as we were getting ready to record, it looks like the Grizzlies and Suns put together a trade. Basically, Memphis gets Isaiah Todd and two first round pick swaps. Memphis sends out a couple seconds. So, obviously kind of a weird trade where, it doesn't really feel like it accomplishes a whole lot.
Right.
Um, I guess Memphis gets a young player back. He hasn't really panned out so far. As you've seen, right? He played for the Wizards.
Yes.
Um, and they gave up, 2 seconds, got a couple of first round pick swaps. The thing I'm kind of interested in for Phoenix is I believe, because they did that, it clears up a roster spot. So I wonder, if they maybe have somebody that they're kind of looking at, to pick up in free agency. Obviously I don't know who, right? But for example, right, Bol I think was recently waived by Orlando. So he's gonna be, sitting in that free agency market. Kind of a guy who, had an interesting situation with him where he was a guy coming out of college where he was looked at as a pretty good player, but he did have that bad injury,
Yeah.
I believe with his foot.
But yep.
Yeah, exactly. And then his stock, he went from what could have been a solid first round pick, right?
People even
Maybe
had
like
him in the
10
lottery. People had him
in
in
the
the
lottery.
lottery.
Yeah, in the lottery to I think like a late second round pick. I
Yeah,
think
it
like
was
fourth
bad.
or something like yeah. Played a little bit for Denver, but didn't really pan out there, right? They sent him away, sent him to Orlando, where he, had a chance this season, during the early part, played relatively well, and then
Hmm.
kind of ran out of steam.
Yeah.
So clearly, yeah, Orlando, it looks like they're kind of moving on from that. But I wonder if, again, with that Phoenix trade, it does open up a roster spot. So are they a potential destination, for one of these guys, that's kind of still sitting around in free agency? Because again, as we talked about a little bit earlier, there's not really a whole lot of guys left, in terms of that free agent list, right? I guess you could argue, I guess Christian Wood, is kind of sort of at the top, of that list, but they don't really need, I guess, at this point, another, center or big, I guess, because
Yeah.
they've got Drew Eubanks, they have DeAndre Ayton, they got a couple of guys that are probably going to play some time at the four.
Hmm.
Um, but just in general, I do feel like, they're keeping that roster spot open just for somebody.
Yeah.
Because you don't really need Isaiah Todd, and he's probably not going to play at all for
Right.
Phoenix.
Yeah. He didn't
So,
even play for
uh,
the Wizards, so like
yeah, exactly.
barely
So I
played.
feel like, right. So I feel like that's kind of something, interesting. But at the same time, right, it is kind of, I feel like a relatively minor trade.
Yeah.
But it just happened as we were getting ready to record, so I figured we'd talk about
Yeah. I'm still kind of puzzled about it, honestly, but I think it's more of like a contingency plan of,
it. Yeah,
if we do need to pick somebody up, the spot's available because Zay Todd is not going to
yeah.
be playing for us.
More pick swaps, I guess,
Exactly.
you know, But
Because now they have what,
and
three controllable second round picks, which is, I guess, a
something
positive.
like that.
So I
I
don't
think
know.
guess they got a couple back because they
Right,
got a couple seconds back from Memphis, but
right.
they
Not
don't really.
much though.
Yeah, exactly. Phoenix, reportedly they don't care too much about the draft. But
Yeah, we'll
that's
see.
what I've heard.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then moving on, DeJounte Murray recently, a few hours ago, actually, signed a 4-year, $120 million contract extension. Obviously, we've heard about some of these extensions, as of late, right? LaMelo Ball recently
Mhm.
signed one. Anthony Edwards, right, finally signed his. So the DeJounte Murray one, I was kind of unexpected, only just because there wasn't really, I feel like, a whole lot of talks about it. But again, considering Atlanta gave up, a decent amount in terms of picks to get him, and it seems like he wanted to play with Trey Young. Again, you might as well give him an extension. And again, considering what we saw some other guys get in terms of money, I feel like that's fine, right?
Yeah.
Like LaMelo Ball got what, 5 years, 260. I know it's not, you know, I know it kind of depends on certain factors. And obviously, like, it's not so much the money that matters, it's the percentage of the cap. But I feel like that's a pretty solid deal for DeJounte Murray because again, he's pretty good. Um, and again, you traded for him, so you might as well, have him sign long term, so that way, either he doesn't go anywhere, or if you do want to get rid of him, then you can trade him down the line.
Yeah, I like the deal. I have no real problems with it. I think it's a good move. Yeah,
Exactly.
because I mean, like you said, they gave up, almost an arm and a leg to get him, so might as well do the same to keep him. So I have no problems with it. Um, I'm more so concerned with their entire roster. I don't think Dejounte Murray is, their number one concern at all. I don't think he's really a concern in
Right.
general. I think, they have some other roster concerns to be fiddling with.
Yeah. The Knicks final, or excuse me, the Kings finally, completed the Chris Duarte trade. Obviously, this was one, that we had learned about before free agency began, but now, it's basically completed, right? Chris Duarte going to Sacramento in exchange for two
Mhm.
second round picks. So obviously that's a guy that was drafted by Indiana, I believe in the lottery, right? But obviously an older guy for a rookie. I believe he was 24,
Yes.
um, coming out of college, right? So one of the older rookies to be drafted in the lottery, also. Solid player, I guess. But just didn't really seem like he panned out for Indiana. Um, and it kind of sucks that if you're Indiana, you only got two second round picks for a guy that you drafted in the lottery.
Yeah.
But for Sacramento, I feel like you do get somebody that should be able to help you, because he is at an age where he probably won't be much better, right? But as a guy, that's probably just going to be there as a 3-and-D guy, that helps, right? Because Sacramento, they, that's a team, where they're a high volume 3-point shooting team, but they need some defense. So if he can go out there and if he can, play some relatively solid defense for, the Kings, at least for, 15 to 20 minutes a game, I think that's a pretty solid
Yeah.
trade.
Yeah, I have no issues with it, honestly. I think he's a great player, in terms of his age, that is the question, but nonetheless, the potential and the play style is still pretty phenomenal. So I don't really have an issue with it, and I think that helps the Kings, big time.
Yeah. With the Celtics, a couple of rumors there, not shopping Jalen Brown. The expectation is that an agreement on a supermax deal will happen eventually. Obviously, um, there's been talks about Lillard to Boston. And
It's not
again,
happening.
I don't see it. I mean, I know that they can pull off a trade, I think. I mean, I guess you would have to include Jalen Brown if you're, Portland, but at the same time, I don't think Boston would want to do that.
No,
But also, there's suggestions that Lillard doesn't want to play for Portland.
right.
Um,
Or Boston, you mean?
yeah, or excuse me, for
Yeah.
Boston. So I mean, well, clearly he doesn't want to play for Portland
Yeah,
either.
yeah.
But
Both are true
yeah,
statements, regardless.
yeah, but and then in addition, right, and either way, I mean, it's gonna be interesting, right? Because I did kind of think that the Jalen Brown contract was gonna be signed
Hmm.
all by this point, but it hasn't happened. So maybe something happens down the line. I don't know, but I would assume that they would probably sign him to that contract just
Yeah.
because again he's a big part of their team. Um, you know, I, yeah, that's what I think at
Yeah,
least.
I mean, I agree 100%. I thought he was going to get this deal signed pretty quickly. It's kind of funny to see guys like Edwards and LaMelo Ball get signed to those deals a little bit before Jalen Brown, in my opinion. But, I think the money is deserved, whatever the amount is. I know he's eligible to be paid up to what, like 300 million or something like that. So, it's
Yeah.
going to be a monster contract. Um, but I don't know what the holdup is, so I'm curious to hear, more details about it.
More from the Boston Globe.
Hmm.
Adam Himmelsbach. Basically, he
That's
believes
a
that
funny last
Celtics are
name.
stockpiling draft picks
Okay.
for a quote unquote seismic trade in the future. Um,
I guess they do
I'm
have
not
a
sure if the
plethora of second rounders.
yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say because they have a lot of second rounders. I guess they got the two first rounders from Marcus Smart. But one of them was a pick for this year's draft, right? I think that was the Jordan Walsh one, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So, the other one I think is the Warriors pick next year. So
Okay.
I guess they also have some of their own first, but I do. I mean, it makes sense because again, if you're Boston, we know, right? Free agents historically haven't wanted to go there. So, they're kind of a team that sort of has to, build up, a bunch of draft picks and build up trades so that way they can potentially trade for a disgruntled star. Again, what disgruntled star wants to play for Boston, I'm not sure.
Right.
Um, but that's kind of how they've been able to do some of these things, right? Because again, they either have to build through the draft or they have to trade for guys, right? They drafted Tatum and Brown, with those picks that they got back from Brooklyn, right? So those were they built through the draft with those two guys, right? So,
Right.
I mean, there's a potential there, right? But I'm curious as to what it would be.
Yeah, I don't know.
I guess aside from Lillard,
Yeah.
um,
And I guess they're saying down the line, so that means, probably,
yeah,
potentially near
it could be at
future.
the deadline.
Yeah. I'm curious though.
Yeah. More stuff going on. The Knicks reportedly were thinking about trading for Paul George. They decided against it. Um, I guess, apparently it would have included Obi Toppin, Quentin Grimes, Fournier, and three first round picks for Paul George.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
which, that's if you're the Clippers, I guess, interesting. I
Yeah.
mean, I would have thought it would have needed to include RJ Barrett.
Me too.
Um, So that's kind of interesting. I mean, I'm kind of surprised that I would have thought that the Clippers would have turned that down as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to the Knicks. But
Yeah,
I
it's kind of
guess the
interesting.
Knicks decided not. Yeah, the Knicks decided not to do that. I mean, we talked about it with the Clippers. They're definitely under some pressure, to put together a team that's better than last year's team. They made some solid offseason moves, right? They brought back Westbrook on a very cheap contract. They
Mm-hmm.
brought back Plumlee on a very cheap contract. They, traded for KJ Martin. But they still, I think, need another deal. I feel like they kind of need to try to get one of these guys, that's asking, to be traded. Because I
Sure.
just feel like, other than that, if you just run the rest of the roster back, I just don't feel like it's that much better.
Yeah.
Um,
If they get
so
Harden,
I mean,
then that would kind of maybe potentially put them, in a better
yeah.
spot. But it depends
And
on what
again,
they give up.
yeah, and again, we mentioned it, with one of our subscribers, Xander Cade, right? Clippers fan, right? And they
Yeah.
mentioned that they don't really want Harden.
Right.
Which, they preferred, I think like you mentioned, they preferred Russ over Harden in
Right. Which
terms of
is
like
interesting.
they'd rather just have Westbrook and not get Harden, which again, he's a polarizing guy just because, again, he's wanted out of multiple teams for the last several years. And, he's a guy with a playoff resume that's very up and down.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I get it. But I do feel like the Clippers need to pull off something because I just don't feel like running it back,
Is enough.
aside from changing a couple of guys. I just don't feel like that's enough.
No, not at
Um,
all.
yeah, especially again because you also have to factor in the health of their two stars as well. So it would probably help if you could ship out because again, like they have depth, but like some of those guys like don't even really play like that, right? Like Robert Covington didn't really play a whole lot. Marcus Morris pretty much is out of the rotation. So
Right.
if you can turn some of those guys that aren't really playing but are on decent contracts, into a James Harden, I feel like that's a relative plus. But I understand also just the risk in terms of, trading for a guy like that, just because
Sure.
again, he is a polarizing player.
Right. Yeah, I get that 100%.
Yeah. And again, like, clearly they were kicking the tires on thinking about maybe moving Paul George. So they're clearly trying to shake some things up and make some moves.
Right.
Um, Also had a few extra signings. So we'll start with the Grant Williams one, I guess.
Yeah,
Um,
it's the big one.
Stop. Yeah, finally, sign and trade. 4 years, 54 million, going to Dallas. Um, Boston only really got back a couple seconds. It ended up being a three-team deal. So Reggie Bullock of Dallas, he goes to the Spurs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, right, Dallas gets a couple seconds, as well as Grant Williams on that new contract, and then Boston only, like I said, only two second round picks for Grant Williams, which doesn't really seem like, that's that good of a return. I feel like
Right.
I know he kind of fell out of the rotation somewhat, but I feel like he's a good enough player where, two second round picks just feels like
He's
not a
more
whole lot.
valuable than that.
Yeah, I mean, I believe Thomas Bryant, I think at the deadline last year, they netted like 5 second round picks, I think, out of
Yeah.
him. So I feel like he's better than that. But
Yes, for sure.
I do think that's a pretty good signing for Dallas. They've quietly made, I think, some decent moves. Obviously, you had to bring back Kyrie. Regardless of whether or not he's there long term, you have to keep
Mhm.
the asset. Right. So bringing in Grant Williams, they brought in Seth Curry, right, as a shooter, right? Obviously, they made the moves at the draft, right, where they got Lively, and Olivier,
Mhm.
Maxence Prosper,
Yep.
right? Also traded for Rashawn Holmes. Also signed or gave a restricted free agent offer to Matisse Thybulle for 3 years, 33 million, but Portland didn't match it. Um, I think that would have been a pretty solid deal for Dallas if they had gotten it done. Obviously, he's a guy that kind of fell out of favor in Philly because his offense is kind of
Yeah.
detrimental to the team. He's just
It's
not a good
kind of
offensive
similar to
player.
Andre Roberson.
Yeah, for Portland, it's interesting because his time there, he shot almost 40% from three on about 4 attempts a game over his 22 game stint there. So that's kind of something to look into. Where if that 3-point shooting is actually legit, that immediately raises his value significantly because
Absolutely.
then he's not just a guy that you just leave open and play off of, and he can't make you pay at all. If he
Right.
can actually be a really good 3-point shooter, that adds some value. I mean, and if
He
he
can
had been
really
in
be
Dallas,
3 and D.
yeah, and if he was in Dallas, he wouldn't have to shoot a whole lot, since they have other offensive options there. Um, but for Portland, I felt like they were going to match just because it's not really that big of a contract,
Right.
and there's always a potential down the line to trade it and get back something.
Yep.
Especially again, if he actually does get a decent 3-point shot, he can be traded at the deadline.
Exactly.
Um, even with the Jeremy Grant contract, as horrible as it looks, somebody might be interested down the line. Like, maybe somebody might be, I don't want to use the word desperate, but somebody down the line could be like,
It's the
"Hey,
right word.
you know, yeah, it may be, but I'm just saying I could see somebody talking themselves into, hey, who we should look at getting Jeremy Grant. If we get Jeremy Grant, that might be enough to put us over the top." And I'm not saying that's true,
Right.
but I'm just saying I could see somebody doing that. And then I guess that's kind of what you have to look at with a number of these offseason signings, where even if some of these guys aren't there for long term, it's just like even a D'Angelo Russell, right? Like, is there, like, they sign him for 2 years, but is it a guarantee that he's there for 2 years?
No.
No. He might not even make it through the whole season. So,
Right. It
I
all
mean,
depends on
yeah,
how he plays.
yeah, exactly. But either way, I think that's a pretty good get for Dallas because again, it gives you another bigger guy, um, with some size and toughness, got some playoff experience, and he can shoot. So,
Yeah.
you get some extra size and shooting there. That's a pretty good get for Dallas. Obviously, it sucks kind of to lose Reggie Bullock because he was one of their better 3-and-D guys. Um, but either way, right? Grant Williams, I think, still fills a need because they needed
Yeah.
some more size, in that interior spot. If they can get another wing, I think that would be pretty good. Just gave one up in Reggie Bullock, but again, they'll have some contracts I think down the line to maybe move at the deadline.
Yeah.
We'll see, but those I think are some pretty solid additions for Dallas so
Yeah,
far.
me too. I think, those are great additions. Doesn't quite put them, in the position where they need to be, but they're getting close.
Yeah. Um, Another one, Mo Bamba, kind of a smaller ish one, right? But Mo Bamba signed a 1-year minimum contract deal with Philly. So obviously he's going there to be Embiid's backup. Interesting, Paul Reed still hasn't been signed yet. He's a restricted free agent. I feel like he was a pretty solid player for Philly.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see what happens there. But obviously, it takes another big off, big out of the market.
Right.
For a lot of these teams, that are still kind of looking for, a little bit more size, right? We know the Lakers are looking for another backup center. We know Golden State is looking for, some type of backup big, I guess. It's, reportedly they're looking at Saric, but it still hasn't happened yet. So maybe he's weighing his options. But, again, if you look at that center spot, as I mentioned, it's really, really, really slim pickings at this point. I mean,
Basically just
you know,
Christian
I,
Wood left, right?
yeah, exactly. Like I'll list, some of the centers out here, right?
Sure.
We got Christian Wood,
Uh-huh.
Bismack Biyombo, um, old man Taj Gibson,
Oh boy.
old man Blake Griffin, Montrezl Harrell, Udoka Azubuike, Frank Kaminsky, Billy Hernan Gomez, Yurtseven. I think Marco Simonovic just got waived earlier. Tristan Thompson's still out there. Gorgie Jang, Dwayne Dedman, Boban, Myers Leonard, Cauley Stein. Just not really a lot of great options. So I
Right.
mean, I almost kind of wonder at this point for some of these teams, you know, if you have a big man that you had on a two-way, might it just be better to just give one of those guys a regular deal
Absolutely.
as opposed yeah, as opposed to, one of these guys because there's just not a whole lot of impact bigs at this point, right? I mean, Christian Wood will probably go somewhere. I mean, I would have to imagine because I mean he's a solid player, right? Biombo,
Yeah.
I feel like could probably go somewhere as a backup big. Um, but the rest of these guys, like, I feel like it wouldn't shock me if the rest of these guys, like, just weren't on a team, right?
Yeah,
Like,
that wouldn't
would it
surprise me
surprise
either.
you if yeah, like, would it surprise you if Taj Gibson or Blake Griffin or Montrezl Harrell, like, would it surprise you if those guys are just kinda just sitting in free agency? Like,
No,
I just
my
yeah,
expectation is for them to be there actually.
yeah. I mean, again, of the names I mentioned, other than Christian Wood, who's the next most likely guy to get signed to a team? Is it Biombo? Is
Probably
it
it's
Tristan
probably
Thompson?
Biombo or like Trez, but I don't know.
Yeah,
It's rough.
yeah, yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. Myers Leonard, Tristan Thompson, I mean, are those I mean, I don't know. So it is just kind of interesting because Bamba he played for LA last year, right? Got hurt, didn't really do a whole lot. So I do kind of wonder how he looks in Philly. Kind of interesting. It sort of continues a trend of bigs that go from LA and then go to Philly. If I'm not mistaken,
True.
right? Dwight, I think he went to LA
Mm-hmm.
and then went to Philly. Drummond went to LA and then he went to Philly.
Yep.
Trez, LA and then Philly, and then
Yeah.
now I guess Bamba LA to Philly. So
Oh
just
boy.
kind of yeah,
I
kind
do
of
like the
interesting.
signing though for a minimum. You can't beat that.
For a minimum, there's no issues there. Just because again, it's a young guy, with some size. Maybe he pans out for Philly, and if he doesn't, it's a minimum contract.
Right.
So
You didn't really
there's
lose
risk.
anything.
Yeah, it's low risk, potentially solid reward.
Right.
But those are the type of deals that are fine, right? Minimum contracts, there's like no issues whatsoever. Now, there's always the scenario where again you're waiting for somebody, to kind of get waived, or maybe you're just waiting around
Right.
because you believe that there will be somebody there, right? Because again, Christian Wood, he's still in free agency. So and again, there's gonna be a team eventually that's gonna sign him, and you're gonna be like, wow, this team got a decent player, for a relatively, low contract. Again,
Right.
he's got some concerns. Obviously, there's a reason why he's bounced around, and there's a reason why he hasn't gotten signed yet. But somebody will take a gamble on him.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then finally, Raptors eyeing Ayo Dosunmu, right? The Bulls restricted free agent guard. Played relatively well for the Bulls,
Mm-hmm.
but he still hasn't been given a contract, right? Kobe White was re-signed. So I do kind of wonder what's going on there, right? They signed Javon Carter. They still have Lonzo, who's on the reserve, right? He's
Right.
not going to play, I don't think,
Right.
this
No.
year. So kind of interesting. I wonder if he does go somewhere, or if Chicago just kind of re-signs him again. There's not really too many teams with cap left, so
I
I
think
do
they'll
kind of wonder
re-sign
what
him.
happens. Yeah, I mean, with the Raptors, I mean, they lost Fred Van Vliet, so they replaced him with Dennis Schroeder. Probably would like another additional point guard, just so that way he's not the only one. Um, but I
Sure.
don't know. Again, like, even when you look at the point guard free agent list,
It's
in
not.
terms of
It's
who's
not all
left,
that.
yeah, like I mean, again, it's mostly either older players, right, like George Hill, Dellavedova, Howell Neto,
Jeez.
Michael Carter Williams, right? Goran Dragic, DJ Augustine. I mean, there's some young guys, right? But not a ton, right? I mean, Kendrick Nunn is there, but even he's not really, he's more of like a vet in terms of age at this point. I think he's about 28.
Yeah.
Um, so that's the issue, with a lot of these. It's just there's just not a lot of options left at
Right.
this point.
It's a poor
You might as
class.
well take, yeah, you might as well take a gamble if you can.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, we appreciate the views and the likes and the comments and the support that we've gotten over the last week or so, right? Because it seems like a lot of traction has picked up with this channel again, so we appreciate that. Obviously, as we mentioned, we'll be headed out to Vegas. So by the time this episode comes out, we'll have already been there. We'll probably have already seen some games.
Uh huh.
So be prepared for us to talk on Monday's episode right about it. So again, thanks for listening. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you Monday.